The conference room on the 14th floor of Hartman Marine smelled the way it always had, cedar wood polish, and the faint ghost of burnt coffee from the machine in the corner. I had sat at the head of that table for 31 years. I knew every scratch on the surface, every loose thread in the upholstered chairs. But that Tuesday morning in October, 3 days after we buried my son, the room felt like somewhere I had never been before. Nathan had been 44 years old, a heart attack, sudden and without warning, on a Saturday afternoon while he was raking leaves in the backyard. His wife, Evelyn, had been inside the house when it happened. She told us she heard him call out once. By the time she got to the door, he was already on the ground. I keep thinking about that detail. One call, the funeral, had been on Saturday. By Tuesday, Evelyn had hired a lawyer. She sat across from me now, with her hands folded over a thick envelope, her black dress replaced by a steel gray blazer, and her hair pulled back the way she wore it to corporate meetings. Not the way she dressed to mourn. The way she dressed to win. My daughter Claire sat beside me. She had flown in from Halifax the morning of Nathan's funeral and had not left yet. She kept her hand resting on the table, close to mine, not touching, just close. Evelyn's lawyer, a young man named Gareth who looked like he had graduated law school sometime last spring, cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartman has asked me to present this proposal as a matter of urgency, he said. He slid the envelope toward me with both hands, as if it were something precious. Given the circumstances of Nathan's passing and the current ownership structure of Hartman Marine, she's requesting an immediate transfer of Nathan's 28% share into a family trust, to be managed jointly by herself and her daughter, Lily, until Lily reaches adulthood. He said the circumstances of Nathan's passing, the way you'd say the weather last Thursday. Flat, procedural. I looked at Evelyn. She looked back at me with the patience of someone who had already decided how this meeting would end. Lily is 11 years old, I said. That's correct, Gareth said. Which is precisely why. Lily is 11 years old, I said again, slower, and Nathan has been in the ground for 72 hours. The room went quiet. Outside the window, a container ship was making its way up the St. Lawrence, moving slow and steady the way they always do. Nathan used to stand at this window when he was a boy and watch them. He'd press his small hands against the cold glass and name them as they passed, as if they were old friends. I picked up the envelope and set it on the side table behind me without opening it. I'll need time to review this with my own counsel, I said. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Of course, James, she said. Take all the time you need. But as I walked her and young Gareth to the elevator, I caught the look she exchanged with my head of operations, a man named Douglas, who had been standing near the door the whole meeting and hadn't said a word. It was a quick look. A fraction of a second. The kind of look that passes between two people who have already had a different conversation. I pressed the elevator button for them and smiled and said goodbye. Then I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat very still for a long time. My wife, Margaret, had passed 4 years earlier, breast cancer, caught late. Nathan had been the one who drove her to chemo every Thursday when I couldn't leave the dock operations. He'd sit with her for 3 hours, and then drive her home and make her soup, and he never once told me how hard that was for him. I found out from Claire years later. That was Nathan. He carried things quietly. Hartman Marine had been Margaret's idea originally. We'd been 26 years old, living in a 2-bedroom flat in Montreal, and she had looked at the marine freight maps spread across our kitchen table and said, James, the Great Lakes corridor is completely underserved between Kingston and Thunder Bay. If we start small, 2 vessels, contract freight, we can build something real. She was right. It took us 11 years and every dollar we had, and there were winters when I genuinely didn't know if we'd make the next payroll. But by the time Nathan joined the company at 25, Hartman Marine was moving industrial cargo through 4 provinces. By the time Margaret died, our fleet was worth somewhere north of $18 million. I built that for her, for our children. Not for Evelyn. The thing about grief is that it makes you slow. It wraps around your thinking like fog on the river. You can see shapes but nothing sharp. I knew that. I had watched it happen to myself when Margaret died, and I think Evelyn was counting on it happening again. She was wrong. 2 weeks after Nathan's funeral, I received a call from the HR coordinator at our Kingston terminal. She had found a series of internal memos she didn't understand, purchase orders for a consulting services vendor called Clearwater Advisory Group, authorized by Douglas. She had gone looking for the corresponding invoices and found nothing that matched our regular supplier files. She called me instead of Douglas because, as she put it quietly, I wasn't sure who else to call. I told her she had done exactly the right thing. I asked her to forward me everything she had and to tell no one. I spent that weekend going through the documents alone in my home office in Westmount. Margaret's reading chair was still on order. I haven't moved it. What I found in those files was a systematic drain. Not dramatic, not obvious, but steady. Clearwater Advisory Group had been billing Hartman Marine for logistics consulting services since 18 months ago. The invoices were professional and plausible, averaging between $40,000 and $60,000 each, often accompanied by detailed-looking reports full of industry jargon that sounded authoritative until you tried to trace any of the recommendations back to actual operational changes. None of them existed. Over the course of those 18 months, Douglas had approved transfers totaling just over $400,000 to Clearwater. I looked up the business registration for Clearwater Advisory Group. It had been incorporated in Ontario 14 months ago. The registered director was a numbered company in New Brunswick, but the mailing address on the original incorporation documents, before it was changed 6 months later, was a condo building on Wellington Street in Ottawa. Evelyn's address. I closed the folder. I sat back in the chair. I looked at Margaret's chair in the corner. I'm sorry, I thought. I should have paid closer attention. I called my corporate lawyer the next morning. Her name is Patricia Chen, and she has been practicing commercial litigation in Montreal for 25 years. When I walked her through what I had found, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "James, before we do anything else, I need you to tell me everything you know about the ownership structure Nathan set up for Lily's trust." That question stayed with me for the rest of the day, because the answer was almost nothing. Nathan had come to me 2 years ago and told me he was restructuring some of his personal estate planning, putting Lily's inheritance into a dedicated family trust. He said it was standard, that his financial planner had recommended it. I had been in the middle of a contract dispute with a Thunder Bay operator and had nodded along and not asked enough questions. I had trusted him. He was my son. I called his estate lawyer, a man named Frank, who Nathan had used for everything, and asked for a full copy of Nathan's trust documents. Frank called me back the next day, and I could tell from the first second of silence that something was wrong. "James," he said, "I need to let you know that I received a call from Evelyn's lawyer last week, asking me to hold all trust documentation pending a review. I wasn't sure how to handle that, so I've been waiting to hear from the estate executor." "Who is the estate executor?" I asked. Another pause. "Evelyn," he said. I thanked Frank and hung up. Here is what I had at that point. A fraudulent consulting company connected to Evelyn's address, a head of operations who had approved the payments, a daughter-in-law who had been named executor of my son's estate, and no access to Nathan's trust documents. And here is what I needed to find out. Whether any of this had started before Nathan died, or whether Evelyn had simply moved fast afterward. The answer to that question would determine everything. I hired a private investigator named Paul Girard, a retired RCMP officer, who had spent the last decade doing corporate fraud work in Quebec. He was methodical, careful, and extraordinarily expensive. I handed him the Clearwater documents and Evelyn's connection to the mailing address, and I told him to go back as far as he needed to go. While Paul worked, I did my own digging. I had kept every email Nathan had ever sent me about the business, not because I'm sentimental, because Margaret taught me early that the paper trail is the only thing that protects you. I went through 14 months of correspondence looking for anything unusual. I found it in a thread from 8 months ago. Nathan had emailed me about a proposed vendor review, a routine audit of our service suppliers, including third-party consultants. He'd mentioned in passing that Douglas had flagged it as not urgent and suggested pushing it to next quarter. I had agreed without much thought. That vendor review would have caught the Clearwater payments. Douglas had delayed it, and Nathan, trusting a man who had worked for our company for 12 years, had let it slide. I don't know if Nathan ever found out. I hope he didn't. I hope the last 2 years of his life were not spent carrying that weight on top of everything else. But I don't know. And that not knowing is something I've had to learn to put down. At least for now. Paul came back to me 3 weeks later with a file that I read standing up at the kitchen counter because I couldn't bring myself to sit. Douglas and Evelyn had been acquainted for 7 years before she married Nathan. They had met at a business networking event in Toronto. Paul had found a decade-old LinkedIn connection, joint attendance at 3 industry conferences, and, most critically, bank records showing a pattern of personal transfers from Douglas to a private account, the most recent of which had occurred 6 weeks after Nathan's funeral. They had been in contact throughout the marriage. The Clearwater payments were not opportunistic. They were planned. Douglas had been funneling company money into Evelyn's holding company for 1.5 years, while Nathan was alive and running the business he thought he was running. I read that last sentence twice. Then I set the folder down on the counter beside Margaret's old coffee mug, the one Claire keeps washing and putting back, even though nobody uses it, and I stood very still. My son had been surrounded by it, the whole last chapter of his life. And he had never known. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the boardroom and the lawyers and what Patricia found buried in those trust documents, I want to ask you something. If you've ever had to hold yourself completely together on the outside while something is breaking on the inside, you know what the next 2 weeks felt like. If you're watching from somewhere that knows cold winters and long silences, you probably know the feeling exactly. Hit the like button if you've ever had to be the calm one, when calm was the hardest thing to be. Now, let me tell you about the trust. Patricia called me on a Thursday evening and asked me to come to her office the following morning. Not an unusual request, but something in her voice was careful in a way that made me sleep poorly that night. I arrived at 8. She had the documents spread across the conference table and a coffee waiting for me, which I did not touch. Nathan's trust, she said, was amended 11 months ago. Amended how? She turned one of the documents toward me and pointed to a clause near the bottom of the 3rd page. In the original version, Hartman Marine shares held under the trust could only be transferred or sold with consent from both the executor and a second named co-trustee, which was you, James. You were the co-trustee. I remember signing something about that, I said. 2 years ago, yes, but in the amendment, the co-trustee requirement was removed. The executor, Evelyn, now has sole authority to manage and transfer the trust assets. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the amendment document. It was Nathan's, his handwriting, or something very close to it. Patricia, I said slowly, did Nathan have any meetings with Frank about this amendment that you can confirm? She looked at me steadily. Frank says Nathan came in alone, signed, and left. No associate present, no notarization beyond Frank's own witness. And here's the part I need you to hear clearly. She pulled out a second document. Frank's billing records for that meeting show a consultation fee of $300 paid by personal check. The check was drawn from a joint account. She paused. The joint account belonged to Nathan and Evelyn. I understood what she was telling me without her having to say it plainly. Can you challenge it? I asked. Potentially, she said. If we can demonstrate that Nathan was under undue influence, or that the signature was obtained through misrepresentation, we have grounds. But James, that takes time and evidence, and in the meantime Evelyn has the legal authority to begin moving those shares. How much time do we have? She's filed a motion for a formal estate review with the Quebec Superior Court. The hearing is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I drove home. I sat in the kitchen. I looked at Margaret's chair. Then I made a phone call I had been putting off for 2 weeks. I called Claire. She listened without interrupting while I told her everything. The Clearwater payments, Douglas, Paul's investigation, the trust amendment. When I finished, there was a long quiet on the line. Dad, she said finally. When Nathan came to visit me in Halifax 2 years ago, the January visit, do you remember? He was strange the whole weekend, quieter than usual. On the last night, we went for a walk and he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, Claire, if something ever happens, make sure Dad looks at everything himself. Don't let anyone summarize it for him. Make him look at it himself. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was tired. I thought maybe he and Evelyn were going through something. I had to set the phone down for a moment. Nathan knew, or suspected, and he had tried in the way he always tried to handle things, quietly, indirectly, carrying it alone, to leave a warning. He had trusted that Claire would remember, and Claire had. I asked Claire to do something for me before she went back to Halifax, something that would feel strange, but that I needed. She drove to Nathan's house on the pretext of collecting some of his personal items she had left during the funeral week. Evelyn let her in. While she was there, she spent some time in Nathan's home office, a room Evelyn had not yet touched, and she found in the bottom drawer of his desk a USB drive taped underneath manila folder. She called me from the parking lot. "There's a password," she said. "But Dad," he taped a sticky note underneath it. "The password is Margaret's birthday, October 3rd, 1952. I had to pull over. The drive contained 3 things. A scanned copy of Nathan's original trust document, unamended, with his own handwritten note in the margin. "Keep this." A folder of emails between Nathan and a financial consultant he had spoken to independently. Emails in which he raised concerns about inconsistencies in third-party billing and asked for a private review. And a short audio file, 18 minutes long, recorded on his phone approximately 9 months ago. I listened to that recording alone in my office with the door locked and the lights off because I did not want anyone to see my face. It was Nathan, talking to himself the way he sometimes did when he was working through a problem. His voice was calm. He had always been calm, my son. He said he had been going through the vendor accounts and found payments he couldn't explain. He said he had raised it with Douglas and received a reasonable-sounding explanation that he nonetheless didn't fully believe. He said he wasn't sure what to do. He didn't want to be wrong. He didn't want to accuse someone without proof. He was going to give it another month. He said near the end, "If this is what I think it is, I need to make sure Dad is protected. He trusts too easily. He always has." Margaret used to say that. She said, "James sees the best in people, which is wonderful and also sometimes dangerous." He laughed a little when he said that. A quiet laugh. The kind that means you're smiling at a memory. I sat in the dark with that laugh for a long time. Patricia moved fast once we gave her the USB drive. The original trust document established my co-trustee status beyond any challenge. The financial consultant emails corroborated the billing concerns Nathan had raised. The audio file, while not legally definitive on its own, painted a picture of a man who had been investigating the same fraud we had uncovered, and who had taken steps to protect the evidence before he died. Paul Gerard submitted his full investigative report to Patricia's office 4 days before the Superior Court hearing. It included the Clearwater payment records, Douglas's direct financial transfers to his personal account, the paper trail connecting Evelyn to the consulting company, and cell records showing 17 calls between Evelyn and Douglas in the 30 days following Nathan's death. Patricia filed everything with the court. She also filed a separate criminal referral with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I had one more thing to do before the hearing. I called Douglas. I invited him for coffee. I told him I needed to talk through some operational things before the estate review. I kept my voice tired and vague. He said yes without hesitating, which told me everything I needed to know about how he thought this was going to go. We sat in a coffee shop on Notre Dame Street. He had an Americano. I had nothing. He spent the first few minutes talking about the upcoming Q4 freight contracts, confident and relaxed, the way people are when they believe they're in control of a situation. I waited until he finished. "Douglas," I said, "I want to give you an opportunity before things go any further. If there's something you want to tell me, about Clearwater, about the payments, about any of it, now is the time." He looked at me. His expression shifted. Not much. He was practiced at keeping his face still, but enough. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," I said, "and I think you should speak to a lawyer today. Not tomorrow. Today." I left my coffee money on the table and walked out. He called Evelyn within the hour. Paul's team had been monitoring the number. The hearing was held on a cold Wednesday morning in November. The courtroom was small and administrative, not the dramatic wood-paneled rooms you imagine. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of old paper. Evelyn arrived with Gareth and 2 additional lawyers I hadn't seen before. She was dressed immaculately, as always. She saw me across the room and held my gaze for a moment before looking away. Claire sat beside me. Patricia sat on my other side. The judge reviewed Patricia's submissions for 45 minutes. The opposing lawyers raised procedural objections to the USB drive evidence, which the judge noted and set aside for a full evidentiary hearing later. But the original trust document, the unamended copy Nathan had preserved, established my co-trustee status clearly enough that the judge ruled it had to be treated as operative, unless and until the amendment could be proven valid through proper process, which meant the share transfer motion was denied. Hartman Marine's ownership structure remained intact pending further proceedings. Gareth asked for an adjournment. The judge denied that too. As we walked out of the courthouse into the gray November air, Patricia put her hand on my arm. "That's not the end," she said. "The amendment challenge will take months. The criminal referral could take longer. But the asset is protected." "I know," I said. "You did well, James." I nodded. I looked up at the sky. It was the flat white color that comes before the first snow. The kind of sky Nathan and I used to watch from the dock when he was a teenager, betting each other on whether it would fall before midnight. He would have been 45 in February. In the months that followed, the RCMP investigation moved at the slow, thorough pace that financial crimes investigations move. Douglas resigned from Hartman Marine before the end of November. He didn't fight the termination. I think by that point he had understood the full weight of what was coming. Evelyn's lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging the USB drive, challenging Paul's investigative methods, challenging the chain of custody for the Clearwater documents. Patricia answered everyone. The amendment to Nathan's trust was eventually ruled invalid by the court on the grounds of procedural irregularities, and this took 11 months to establish, expert testimony that raised serious questions about the signature's authenticity. The original trust, the one Nathan had protected and hidden and left for us to find, was reinstated in full. Evelyn and Douglas were both charged in connection with the Clearwater fraud. I won't tell you how those proceedings ended, because they are still making their way through the system. And I learned long ago not to speak about things before they are finished. What I will tell you is that the $400,000 that was taken from Hartman Marine has been fully recovered and returned to the company accounts. I kept my promise to myself about Lily. Lily was 11 years old when her father died. She did not choose her mother. She did not choose any of this. She had worshipped Nathan. I had watched that over the years, the way she followed him around the house when she was small, the way she insisted on wearing his old Hartman Marine cap that was 3 sizes too big for her head. Whatever happens with Evelyn, Lily did not deserve to lose both her father and her grandfather in the same year. I called Lily's school in January and spoke with her guidance counselor. I arranged for a family therapist, independent of the legal situation, to be available to Lily for as long as she needed. I also sat with her. Just the 2 of us, at a Tim Hortons near her school, because that was where she wanted to go. And I told her in plain words that she was loved, that none of what had happened between the adults was her fault, and that her father had been a good man who had loved her completely. She cried. I did too. "Do you think he knew?" she asked. She meant about Evelyn and Douglas. She was old enough to understand the outline of it. "I think he was trying to protect the people he loved," I said. "That's who he was." She nodded and wrapped both hands around her hot chocolate and didn't say anything else for a while. That was enough. "I'm 67 years old. I have run a marine freight company for 31 years, and I have learned that the water does not care about your plans. It doesn't care about your schedule, or your contracts, or your grief. It moves the way it moves, and your only job is to learn to read it." Margaret understood that. Nathan understood it too, in his quiet way. Last spring, I stood on the dock at our Kingston terminal and watched a container ship pass, the way I've watched hundreds of them pass over the years. The morning was cold and bright, the river flat and silver. Claire was standing next to me, her hands in her pockets, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she said, "Nathan would have loved this morning. He would have named the ship," I said. She smiled. It looked like him when she did that. I have amended my own estate structure since then, Thoroughly, carefully, with Patricia's guidance at every step and my own eyes on every page. The company will go to Claire and to a newly established foundation in Margaret's name, which will fund apprenticeships for young people entering the marine freight industry who don't have the connections or the capital to get started on their own. Margaret believed in giving people the first foothold. I believe in finishing what she started. A man can survive losing the people he loves. He cannot survive losing himself. The only way through is to stay clear-eyed, stay patient, and hold on to the things that are real, the work, the people who actually showed up, the memory of those who showed you what integrity looked like, before you were old enough to fully understand it. Nathan showed me that, in the end, even from a bottom desk drawer, with a USB drive and a sticky note and his mother's birthday for a password. I will not forget it.